some familiar faces in the audience. It's great. I'm Amy Scott, and I'm a senior correspondent at Marketplace and host of How We Survive, which is a Marketplace podcast about people navigating solutions to a changing climate. And it just so happens that this season is all about water in the West. We talk a lot about the Colorado River, which, as you probably know, especially those of you in LA, provides water to 40 million people in 7 states, 30 tribal nations, 2 different countries, and has lost trillions of gallons to rising temperatures caused by our burning of fossil fuels. Last season, though, Bo touched on the Mississippi River, and we spent some time in a Delta community facing relocation because of the challenges of sea level rise and land subsidence, and frequently, more frequent intense storms. And so I was really excited when Tenacross invited me to moderate this panel to talk about these 2 very different river systems that in many ways are facing opposite challenges, although as we've seen in the last couple summers, they share some concerns with drought as well, and to learn how the management of these rivers can inform other problems that we're going to be facing with climate change. So we'll get right into it. I wanted to start with each of you just introducing yourself. Tell us a little bit about your current role and how you came to this work. And Bo, do you want to start?
Sure, absolutely. So my name is Bo Jones. I'm with the Water Institute of the Gulf. We are an independent applied research organization that's headquartered in Louisiana, but we work actually from end to end of the Tenacross network. We've done some work on the LA River all the way over to Jacksonville, Florida, but generally we focus around the Mid-Atlantic down to the Gulf South. And so we are, an applied research organization. That's the kind of where we cut our teeth working around the Louisiana and Gulf South, trying to use research and planning and technology to help decision makers make decisions that are based on science, that are based on rigor, and not just on politics and the many other factors that might influence decisions. We try and work on not just the science side of things, but recognizing, and this is really going to get into this conversation, we can have great science, we can have great reports, but what about the standards that are set, right? What about, how are the government entities applying these things? And then also solutions. How are communities and tribes and areas deploying what we learn from this? So we really try and focus in the science, standards, and solutions area. My background is actually, I'm an environmental litigator. Came into this after the oil spill, but have spent a lot of time in and around coastal Louisiana working on these issues. So really excited to dive into this conversation.
All right, Elizabeth.
Hi, everyone. My name is Elizabeth Cobley. I'm an associate professor of political science at the University of Nevada, Reno, and I am also the associate director of our graduate program in hydrologic sciences. And so it's a bit of a weird job, but I fit right kind of in the middle of those 2 worlds. I work on water policy and water governance. I am particularly interested in my research about how to design policy processes, governance arrangements that incentivize collaboration among diverse communities. And I've been looking at these issues in the Colorado River Basin. I know we're going to talk a little bit about some collaborative efforts in a while, but looking at these issues in the Colorado River Basin that have really evolved since the current mega drought started in the year 2000. So I came to working on these issues through kind of a winding path. I grew up in the Colorado River Basin. I grew up in Phoenix. I always wondered why we ran water through cement canals in the desert. And I think that got me interested in just kind of how our water systems work. I was fortunate to kind of dabble in some environmental literature and aquatic ecology and all these different fields, and I finally got into the place where I was ready to go back to grad school and did my PhD in an interdisciplinary environmental studies program. And so now I'm really excited to continue working on these issues with a lab of students and postdocs and lots of wonderful collaborators, including some of the folks who are already on the first panel and on my team for the National Climate Assessment as well. So yeah, really happy to be here. Thank you.
So Elizabeth, staying with you, how would you describe the primary challenges facing the basin that you study, the Colorado, right now, and how shared governance with multiple stakeholders both challenges and presents solutions to those concerns?
Yeah, definitely a big and important question. So you already mentioned that the Colorado River provides water to 40 million people from Denver to LA to Phoenix and Tucson, irrigates over 5 million acres of really productive farmland in the southwestern US, provides water for 30 tribes, 2 states in Mexico, and a lot of the environments and recreational opportunities that we love. That's why many of us live in the western United States, right? So the Colorado River really is kind of the lifeblood of this region. And it has a couple primary intertwined challenges. So right now, I would say our 2 biggest challenges are just an overall reduction in water supply and persistent overuse of the river that's led to declining reservoir levels. And part of the reason for that is because over 100 years ago, we divided up this river among the 7 states in the US and later provided an allocation to Mexico. And we essentially gave up more rights to water than there is actually water in the river in any given year. And that's led to kind of this institutionalized overuse and dependence on our reservoirs. So I think that's really kind of a key part of this. It only gets worse when climate change happens. So we're seeing these rising temperatures. We call our drought in the Colorado River Basin a hot drought. So it's more about rising temperatures, more evaporation, quicker snow melt, those sorts of things, rather than just a lack of precipitation, which might characterize a drought in other places. And as a result of our reservoirs being low, not refilling because we're seeing these climate impacts, we're just seeing huge impacts to all of the sectors that depend on the Colorado River. We're seeing historic cuts to cities along the Colorado River, challenges to our hydropower generation at our major dams and reservoirs, challenges to critical infrastructure. About a year ago, the Secretary of the Interior had to step in and say we're going to actually hold back water up in our upper reservoir, Lake Powell, in order to protect critical water infrastructure. So many challenges that affect the entirety of the basin. And getting to your second part of that question about collaboration, which I'm happy to talk more about later, but I think what I'll say for right now is that the basin has taken a largely collaborative approach since 2000 when we realized we were getting into this situation, or I should say maybe around 2005, 2007 when we started to see the effects. But there's no one person who makes decisions in the Colorado River Basin. There's no king of the Colorado River Basin. I tell my students this all the time. This kind of fragmented governance structure where we have so many people making decisions at all different scales and all different jurisdictions, it makes it really hard to manage for those system scale problems. We do a pretty good job collaborating in our communities, and we have some really neat innovations that have come up. We're definitely finding ways to be more water resilient, but I think we're still suffering with the challenges of meeting these basin scale, basin level goals, and I think that transition to thinking about the Colorado River Basin as a system is something that's actually just kind of starting now, even though we have had a pretty good history of collaboration. So I'll turn it over to you, and we can touch back on some of this.
You've got even more states involved.
Yeah, so that, the Mississippi River, right, runs from Lake Itasca down right past our office to the Gulf of Mexico, but the Mississippi Basin, right, contains 51% of the country. 31 states, 2 Canadian provinces. The Missouri River Basin runs all the way to Montana and into Canada. The Red and the Arkansas run all the way to New Mexico and Colorado. Right, so the Ohio and Tennessee runs all the way into New York. And then we have, our piece that we focus on a lot, which is the lower Mississippi, which we consider from Cape Girardeau, Missouri, south to the Gulf. So what are the biggest challenges there, right? It's a pretty complicated set of stakeholders, a pretty complicated set of ecological and human and climate factors that affect the Mississippi River Basin. But when you look at it, and really kind of the bottom line up front of this talk is, and when Duke and I were first talking about this, the Mississippi and the Colorado are typically put on opposite ends of the spectrum. Likely because the primary motivation for managing and thinking about and making decisions around the Mississippi River has been when we have too much water, right? Since 1717, people have been trying to levee the Mississippi River. Since the 1927 flood, we have said, chain this monster. Make sure that it doesn't flow freely. Let's make sure it doesn't flow in people's yards and people's towns. And so flood control has been the mantra for the Mississippi River. Now, at times we have too much water, but right now we don't have enough. And it has critical impacts, not just in, it's not just the water resources, water use, communities, but it factors into navigation. 60% of America's export for grains goes down the Mississippi River, right? The largest port complex in the world is between Baton Rouge and the mouth of the Mississippi River. And so there are significant, economic and transportation efforts that ebb and flow with the water ebbing and flowing. But with the Mississippi River, it's not just water, and that's the critical piece for us down in Louisiana in particular. There's a couple different factors, a couple different things that we're looking at. We're looking at water, right? We're looking at sediment, infrastructure, and nutrients. All four of these things have a critical impact on various stakeholders and areas. So, what is the biggest challenge, right? It is trying to have a multi-factor, multi-objective approach to a very, very complex system that is the Mississippi River Basin with a whole lot of parties, right? We are underway right now, the federal government is underway with a 7-state comprehensive study from Cape Girardeau south, trying to pull in just those 7 lower states to try and connect the dots. And it's very complex, but in Louisiana, we're often, like many of us, like Arizona with aridity, but in Louisiana, for sea level rise and subsidence and those climate change effects, we're a canary in the coal mine, right? And what our organization, and particularly, and much of many of the people here who have worked in and around Louisiana and the Gulf South, we take these challenges and we say, okay, yes, there's a challenge, but behind every challenge and buried within every challenge is an opportunity, right? How can we take this as an opportunity to improve not only the management process for Mississippi River, but improve those communities and find opportunity out of this risk? So in the Mississippi River, there are times where we have too much. There's times where we don't have enough. There's times where we have too much sediment, not only in ports that are trying to bring deep draft ships in, but too much sediment behind the dams on the Missouri River Basin, right? The life cycle of a dam is how long it's going to take for that sediment to fill up behind it. But then we also have saltwater intrusion. I'm going to pause on this one little thing to kind of connect back to the aridity. So sea level. Okay, so my house in New Orleans, I'm high and dry. I'm about 1.5 feet above sea level. So if anybody needs a place to go in the next storm, come on over. But sea level at the Thoweg, the bottom of the Mississippi River, is somewhere around Vicksburg, Mississippi, right? So if you take the bottom of the river, the bottom of the channel, and if you were to stop the Mississippi River from flowing, the Gulf of Mexico would go all the way towards Vicksburg, Mississippi. So when we have low flow conditions like we have a Midwest drought right now, that salt water, which is more dense, starts riding up a wedge under the Mississippi River. And this has been happening since documented since the 1940s, but it happened in a big way this year. So the issues of saltwater intrusion, aquifer stress, and how we balance aquifers versus surface water, and then all the navigation, recreation, community benefits, agriculture, ecosystem restoration, all of these problems and users and stakeholders in the Mississippi River. There's no more water doesn't help it. It just changes the problem dynamic. So the challenge is, how do we put all those things on the table? How do the stakeholders put all their values on the table on day one and figure out how to manage this system in a way that is not just a single focus really the Mississippi River was from 1927 to, let's call it 1969 with the passage of NEPA, where it was flood control only, and then they said, well, we'll look at environment a little bit.
Collaboration I mean, Elizabeth was saying that actually, since the reality of the mega drought really set in, there's been more collaboration among the Colorado River Basin states. Is that happening for the Mississippi, and what would it take to get there?
Yeah, so, there are areas where progress has absolutely occurred. If you look at what's going on right now, so I mentioned this, that, in the Water Resource Development Act, WRDA, which is the authorization for many of the U.S. Civil Works through the Army Corps of Engineers, they passed in 2020 the Lower Mississippi River Comprehensive Study. And it's a 5-year, $25 million study that, is supposed to pull these 7 states together. And connect the dots between, I think I listed them all, but, hurricanes and storms and flood control, navigation, ecosystem and environmental restoration, water supply, hydropower, recreation, and then other, as defined by the Secretary, right? So all of these different uses and pull them together. So that's going on in theory, and it's technically happening right now. But oftentimes these big mega, feasibility study type conversations, sometimes the true collaboration there is in name only. And so there's a tremendous opportunity sitting in front of the federal government and the Army Corps of Engineers to really bring together the stakeholders, not just the state level, but the NGOs and the communities and along the river to kind of co-design an effort to reimagine the way that we manage that river. So there's a tremendous opportunity there. A couple months ago, Elizabeth and I were talking about this yesterday. A group of 30 mayors along the Mississippi River got together and said, well, if y'all won't do it, we will. And we're going to come up with a plan for the Mississippi River. So there are elements of this where we are recognizing that there's a shared risk and shared salvation up and down that basin. But one of the things, too, is, after the 1936 Flood Control Act, we had this, position created, the Water Resources Council, which was supposed to connect all of the federal agencies across the United States, right? So all the federal agencies had, somewhat of a water czar. There was a council that had 50 technical staff that reported to the White House and convened all the federal agencies. 1981, somebody talked about Governor Reagan. This is President Reagan. 1981, they come in and they shutter that agency. They cut the appropriations for it. So the Water Resource Council still exists in legislation. It is still authorized, but has not operated since the early 1980s. And so this was, this entity that was there to connect all of the federal authorities. So that challenge and that opportunity for the last several decades has really fallen to the United States Army Corps of Engineers, which is a fantastic agency. The Mississippi Rivers and Tributary Project, which is the levees along the Mississippi River, is one of the greatest engineering feats of humankind, and it works fantastically. But it has a sole focus: to stop floodwaters from getting onto fields and towns and to get it out to the Mississippi River as fast as possible. So to really, broaden that out, the Army Corps can only do what, the U.S. Congress tells it to do. And so there's not that clean vehicle to really have that true collaboration. And, in the Colorado River Basin, the resource shortage and the scarcity has, I think, led to some more collaboration. We don't talk about water that much, unless it's in your front yard. It's not something we think about because we got it, but that's starting to change.
So, Elizabeth, I want to talk about who hasn't traditionally been in the room in these management decisions. In the Colorado River Basin, as we talked about, 30 tribes have rights to the river and have been fighting for structural inclusion in the post-26 management guidelines. How is that process going, and what do you think needs to happen to make sure that we right some of these wrongs from history?
Yeah, sure thing. Picking up on that and some things you've said earlier, I think it's really interesting as we've been having some conversations about these two river basins that they do get kind of pitted as opposite sides of the spectrum. You have too much water, we don't have enough water, how do we work that out? But the Colorado River Basin is also heavily engineered in maybe a slightly different way than the Mississippi River, but people will even refer to it as a series of buckets where we just release water from one reservoir downstream to another reservoir, and we manage every drop and track every drop to ensure we're meeting this really complex structure of legal water rights that have been given to to users in the Colorado River throughout the last 100 years. So I think there are some more commonalities where we're sort of working within a system that has institutionalized certain uses of water as good or right, or things we've done forever and we're going to keep doing, and it's excluded others. And I think there are two major ones I want to talk about. Maybe first, just because this connects to what you were saying, is historically using water to support ecosystems has not been considered a beneficial use in the Western United States. States have started to do things like introduce rights for stream flow and rights for habitat into their water law structures, but historically we haven't thought about the environment. When we over-allocated the river, we didn't think about how important it would be to have some water in the river to aid in the transport of our water supply across this really vast basin. So I think the environment hasn't been a major consideration. And then to your point, Amy, I think this is sort of the elephant in the room for the Colorado River Basin right now. We have 30 tribal nations that have rights to about 25% of the Colorado River's average annual flow. It's somewhere like 3.2 million acre feet, which is our weird unit of water in the West. And these tribes, while some of them have gone through the processes of quantifying their water rights and settling their water rights and are able to actually use those water rights on their reservation, many tribes haven't. And this is a problem for many reasons. It's certainly an environmental justice problem, because one of the reasons these tribes have not been able to actually use their water, bring this water to their reservation, is because they lack infrastructure, they lack funding, they essentially have rights to water that they can't use, and what happens? Other people use that water and there's no compensation to those tribes. So that's a really, really important piece of the Colorado River story, figuring out how do we remedy that. I think that one of the other kind of issues with this is, for a broader water management conversation, it creates tons of uncertainty for water managers. We don't know when a tribe is going to settle a water right and then start diverting that water. In my mind, we can pair solving some of these environmental injustices with also creating certainty in the system for water managers if we're able to settle those rights for tribes. And I think with the recent federal legislation, the bipartisan infrastructure law, some of the IRA funding, we've seen a lot of funding directed toward enhancing tribal capacity, working on tribal water rights settlements, and we've also seen examples of tribes being amazing partners in helping states trying to work on these drought issues. So I'm specifically thinking about the Gila River Indian community in Arizona, who agreed to leave some of their water in Lake Mead, our lower reservoir, in exchange for compensation in order to protect water levels, or the Colorado River Indian Tribes community, who has leased water to cities and farmers in times of drought. And so I think figuring out kind of a way to work together, bring these tribes to the table, ensure first that they get their rights, and second, that we can build partnerships and work to solve these broader problems is really critical. We're just starting to turn the corner on that, though. I feel like it's kind of amazing. We had the first ever federal, tribal, state meeting around the Colorado River in July of this summer. The 30 tribes have not had a seat at the table. There's one line in our 100-year-old compact about tribal water rights, and it's extremely vague. And so, we haven't come up with a structure to include all of those tribes. Tribes who haven't settled or quantified their water rights are perhaps even more disempowered than tribes who have. And at least we're having the conversations now, but we're still not to a point where there's structural inclusion for tribes yet. And I think that's really what we're on the forefront of. One last thing I wanted to touch on is you mentioned, Amy, this post-2026 world. That date is really important to us in the Colorado River Basin, because our last set of rules about how to manage shortages in the Colorado River Basin was created in 2007, and it expires at the end of 2026. And we have a huge opportunity to rethink our river system and to create some new rules here. So for instance, we make a lot of our management decisions based on triggers of different reservoir levels, and those levels are actually pretty slow responding to the inputs into the system. We have the opportunity to change things, like maybe make our management decisions based on average flows into the river system that we can now track in real time because we have better science and better data to rely on. And so I think we have this huge opportunity not only to address some of our historical inequities, but to really create more flexibility and adaptiveness in the system overall as we go into this post-2026 world. And that process is really just starting. We're just in the process. It's a NEPA process. So we went through scoping earlier this fall, and now different parties are in the process of developing alternatives that the Bureau of Reclamation, which is sort of our version of the Army Corps of Engineers in the West, they're going to be analyzing and working with stakeholders to try to ensure that these potential alternatives are meeting multiple needs or looking at where they fall short. So this 2026 date is really important, and if you read headlines about the Colorado River, read news stories, it's going to come up because this is sort of our opportunity to either choose if we are going to continue business as usual or if we are going to actually make some of these changes that need to be made to make sure our river system is more sustainable for all of the diverse users.
The audience know that in about 5 minutes we'll open up to some questions, so think about your questions, and I think if you go up to the microphones that are standing in the room, not now, I'll tell you when, I'll call on you. But Bo, I wanted to first I'm curious your response to some of what Elizabeth said, but also you mentioned that mayors are coming up with their own strategy, working toward a compact among themselves, and I'm curious how that process could look and what they might learn from the struggles over the Colorado River and its compact over the last century.
Yeah, so the effort that was spearheaded by a group of mayors, it kind of took place over the summer, and one of the things. If you've spent any time downriver on the Mississippi River, one of the things that you'll notice is that most of the cities turn their back to the river, right? Most of the cities, the river is kind of the starting point from which you look out. Every once in a while, New Orleans, we've got the River Walk, and you get the French Quarter, but it's a monster to be feared, right? That's historically how it's been perceived. But I mean, one of the things we deal with in New Orleans is there are people who've grown up who may not have been to the river, who've grown up in town. There are people who don't realize that New Orleans is a coastal city, and so there's a huge opportunity, I think, through the cities and the way the way that the cities plan their design and how they orient themselves and how they program to kind of reinvigorate and reimagine our relationship with water and particularly with the river. As you get upriver, where it's not so, you could throw a rock across it in certain places, Minneapolis, St. Paul, and things like that. There's a different environment. But what that translates to is if you look at the kind of 8 different criteria of the lower river study, as you come down the river, it's flood control and ecosystem restoration. That's what we talk about, and then navigation, right? Making sure we can get the big super Panamax ships in. As you go up, we're talking about agriculture, right? Don't flood my fields or flood my fields. We're talking about recreation. Can I ride my bike along the levee? What are my rights to ride the bike along the levee? And so, those are the type of decisions that cities make every day, right? Of balancing these stakeholders is no different than planning a park, right? It's no different than, how to navigate the different stakeholders, around public property in cities. And so I hope that leveraging some of the mayors and some of those smaller scales and how they interact with the river can serve as a model. Beyond that, I mean, one of the areas that I think, and we've had, we work with, there's some of the cities in the room that we work with, Jacksonville, Mobile, in Houston and Baton Rouge and New Orleans. And one of the things that we really find valuable in terms of how to make decisions, right, is number one, borrow from, kind of the ideals of structured decision making, which is transparent, right, where everybody knows what's going on, they know the decisions that are being made, but also everybody come to the table with your values, right? Don't hide behind, if you are a navigation interest on the river, bring that to the table and say, I'm looking at this through a lens of how to keep navigation flowing. bring your values to the table, and trying to assess some fundamental objectives. What can we all agree on are valuable objectives for this management decision? The other thing, and I mean, bouncing off the NCA 5 conversation and some of the discussions from last night, right? Gone are the days where we can make decisions from the traditional way of making decisions of we're going to predict the future, we're going to model it, and we're going to act. We're going to go towards that almost certain future, right? We have so many uncertainties, whether it's climate uncertainties, stakeholder uncertainties, infrastructure uncertainties, that we've got to rethink the way that we navigate these decisions. Cities are leading with this, using, we were talking earlier about, decision making under deep uncertainty and robust decision making, of throwing that construct on its end and say, rather than trying to predict the future and then plan towards it, let's acknowledge we don't know the future. And then let's take the different scenarios that we can dream up, the different alternatives, and let's stress test that. Let's figure out what happens if we do X. Let's figure out what happens if we do Y. Let's model that. Let's go through that with the stakeholders and decision makers. So one of the things that's most exciting for me when I look at the opportunities, I mean, you have the 2026 date, but through the Lower River Comp Study and all the other efforts along the river, is not just there's great science, there's great technology that we can leverage, there's collaboration and good relationships and all that stuff, but can we rethink the way we make decisions around this river? Can we rethink the way that we take in the climate uncertainty, take in the multi-objective analysis, and try and do this a little bit differently? That's what I hope those efforts can be a model for.
We'll go ahead and open it up to some questions, and then we'll come back for some concluding thoughts.
I don't mean to dominate here, but I'll break the ice. Imagine, for example, that some innovative network went to the best place to start, likely the San Joaquin Valley in California, and demonstrated bring into the valley. The smoke will become. So imagine you could bring solar into the San Joaquin Valley, and you could demonstrate that you could produce the same amount of crops, taking 6 million acres, or not 500,000 acres out of production, saving all the water from those 500,000 acres, and producing energy on them. And that was successful. How would you scale that to the rest of the Colorado River Basin and the Mississippi farming areas?
That's a great question, and something I've written a little bit about. There was an op-ed in the Arizona Republic that a colleague and I put out a couple months ago, thinking about water as something that isn't necessarily a good in itself, but creates these goods that we need, like clean energy and like food, growing crops. And I think we're starting to see some of that shift. For instance, the tribe that I mentioned before, the Gila River Indian Community, they just started a project to line their canals with solar panels for the first time in order to reap some of the benefits of reduced evaporation and also generating clean energy. I think we're starting to see farmers become more interested in those sorts of collaborative efforts, especially as their water rights face greater risk. I'll say in the Colorado River Basin, largely, we use about 80% of Colorado River water for agriculture. We use 20% in cities, and cities have become extremely efficient with their water use. Agriculture is really the place that we need to be looking, not to target agricultural users, but to come up with places where we can change crops, improve irrigation efficiency, come up with longer term solutions, not just some of what we've been doing is basically paying people to temporarily fallow their fields when we really need water. And that is not a long-term sustainable solution financially or for our agricultural producers too. So thinking about some of these types of solutions I think is really important. One thing I've seen work in the Colorado River Basin that was sort of inspirational to me is that we have seen programs that have engaged agriculturalists in conservation that have dispersed across the basin when we have good connections between state governments and NGOs and farmers. I recently was a co-author on a study that came out of the University of Wyoming a couple months ago, and what we heard when we surveyed agricultural users throughout the Colorado River Basin is that they didn't have a lot of trust in their state-level institutions, and that programs where they were involved in this co-design, co-production from the very beginning, or they could work with organizations that sort of could serve as conduits between their needs and these big state government programs, that was key to helping programs be successful. So the one I'm thinking about in particular was a program in 2014 called the Colorado River System Conservation Pilot Program. There was a little bit of money to get people to essentially voluntarily engage in compensated conservation. People weren't sure if it was going to work because of the social perspective on that. And then we had more applications than we could fund for 3 years in a row. And I think, we've seen other places try that without the support of NGOs, without the support of those community connections, and they've failed. And so thinking about the social side of these changes, in my mind, maybe that's my bias as a social scientist, but thinking about the social side of these changes and engaging with communities and engaging in co-production from the beginning, putting your values on the table from the beginning, I think is critical to seeing the diffusion of innovations like that.
On this side, whoops.
Casey Calloway, Chief Resilience Officer for the City of Mobile. I have, in doing our resilience assessment and planning for the city, one of the big things we did as a starter was determine a couple of just key factors, our climate risk. So we chose our 2040 year, and we chose 2 feet of sea level rise, and we chose a particular gauge that we are using as our data extrapolation. So that was kind of some stuff that we're doing. What we know, though, is we're the only ones that are doing it. Certainly in the coastal Alabama area, likely across a large swath of the Gulf of Mexico. What I would love to know, I love what both of you have said about bringing your values to the table. I would love to understand, are there a few basic data points or future data points or long-term data, I don't know what you want to call it in terms of a climate risk or risk number, that y'all see folks needing to all agree on in order to then move the rest of the table forward? If that makes sense as a question. What's the magic few bits that everybody has to say, okay, I agree with that, and that still matches my values? Thank you.
Thanks, Casey. Thinking about it in our neck of the woods, right? You from the original home of Mardi Gras, me from the perfecter of Mardi Gras, I will say. We had to continue that on. Where I think there's a lot of overlap here, okay, is, and this is something we're dealing with in Louisiana, right? A year and a half ago, we had the privilege of working on the first climate action plan in the Deep South, right? And so the state of Louisiana, Deep Red State, has a climate action plan. It's fantastic, and the state did a great job of pulling it together. And we are now in an administration transition from a blue dog Democrat into a Republican administration. And Louisiana is a place in particular that we don't talk about climate change, right? We talk about the effects of climate change. We talk about how to adapt and mitigate to them. We have a 50-year, $50 billion coastal master plan that's built upon, climate assessments and sea level rise projections. But where I see the common denominator here is, and that connects across, it connects the, resilience strategy in Jacksonville to the resilience assessment in Mobile, to work that's being done in LA, and all along that is let's talk about the impacts to humans. and let's talk about where it hits people and the economies that support them. Because we can talk till we're blue in the face about graphs and hydrographs and heat maps and charts and things like that. But what we have found is in Louisiana in particular, and that 50-year, $50 billion, very progressive master plan, unanimously every 6 years, and every year with an annual plan, has been unanimously approved by the Louisiana legislature. And because it centers on what are the impacts to the people and to the communities that are in the footprint. So when I look at the resilience assessment in Mobile, I think about, okay, yeah, we can, 1.5 degrees, we can talk about the climate science, but if we can really boil down to here are the known impacts, and for the canaries in the coal mine, like we are, to be able to show that in real time, I think that's where the common denominator is that can find some alignment.